Jesus once told a story in which the hero was the one person in the room that everyone listening despised. That was not an accident. The lawyer who prompted the story was a religious expert, surrounded by religious experts in a culture where Samaritans were considered ethnically compromised, theologically heretical, and ritually unclean. Jesus chose the Samaritan deliberately, not to be provocative for its own sake, but because the point he was making could only be made by choosing him, and the reason why it had to be the Samaritan who stopped, and why it could not have been anyone else and still carry the same weight, is the thing Carl Jung spent his career trying to explain. The parable appears in Luke chapter 10, and it begins with a question that sounds theological, but is actually a boundary question. A lawyer stands up to test Jesus and asks what he must do to inherit eternal life. Jesus turns the question back on him. The lawyer recites the two great commandments, love God and love your neighbor, and Jesus tells him he has answered correctly. But the lawyer, Luke tells us, wanting to justify himself, asks a follow-up question. And who is my neighbor? That phrase, wanting to justify himself, is one of the most psychologically precise observations in the gospel record. The lawyer is not asking out of genuine uncertainty. He is asking because he wants a definition that will tell him who falls inside his obligation and who falls outside it. He wants a list of people who qualify as neighbors so he can fulfill the requirement toward them and feel secure about everyone else. He wants the boundary. Jesus responds with a story rather than a definition, and this choice is itself significant. He does not give the lawyer the list he is asking for. He tells him about a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho who was attacked by robbers, stripped of his clothing, beaten severely, and left half dead on the road. 3 people encounter him. A priest passes by on the other side. A Levite passes by on the other side. And a Samaritan, traveling the same road, sees him, feels compassion, stops, binds his wounds, loads him onto his own animal, brings him to an inn, cares for him overnight, and pays for his continued care before leaving, promising to reimburse any additional expense on his return. Before explaining what Jung's framework reveals about this story, it is worth pausing on what the priest and the Levite actually represent in this context, because the modern tendency is to read them as simply callous or cowardly, and that reading is too easy and misses something more disturbing. The priest and the Levite are not bad people in the ordinary sense. They are the religious professionals of their culture, the people whose entire lives are organized around the law, including the law to love your neighbor. They know the commandment the lawyer just recited. They have recited it themselves thousands of times. The gap between what they know and what they do is not a gap of information. It is a gap of something else entirely, and it is the gap that Jung mapped with the concept of the shadow. Jung's most fundamental insight about human behavior is that the part of a person visible to the conscious self, what he called the ego, is never the whole story. Beneath the conscious self lies the shadow, the collection of qualities, impulses, and capacities that the person cannot or will not integrate into their conscious identity. The shadow is not simply the repository of evil. It contains anything the ego has rejected, repressed, or refused to acknowledge, including weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and fears the person finds intolerable to admit. Jung observed that one of the primary ways the shadow operates is through projection, the unconscious process of seeing in another person what you cannot tolerate seeing in yourself. The qualities you most despise in others are frequently the qualities you have most aggressively refused to acknowledge in yourself. Now look at the wounded man lying on the Jericho road through this lens. He is stripped, beaten, half dead, utterly helpless, completely dependent on the mercy of whoever happens to pass. He represents, in the starkest possible physical terms, everything the priest and the Levite have organized their entire religious identity around not being. Their status, their ritual purity, their social position, their theological authority, all of it is built on the opposite of what that man embodies in that moment. He is not a neighbor to be helped. He is, in the unconscious architecture of their self-perception, a mirror of everything they cannot afford to be. The priest crosses to the other side not simply because helping would be inconvenient or ritually problematic. He crosses to the other side because the wounded man represents his own shadow, the vulnerability and helplessness he has spent his entire religious career constructing an identity around denying. This is not an accusation invented by Jung about first-century priests. Paul describes the same dynamic in Romans chapter 2, where he writes to those who teach others but do not teach themselves, who preach against stealing but steal, who say one should not commit adultery but commit adultery, who abhor idols but rob temples. The gap between the proclaimed standard and the lived reality is the gap the shadow lives in. The priest who cannot stop for the wounded man is the priest who cannot look at the wounded man because looking at him directly would require looking at the part of himself he has covered with religious performance. There is a plausible, practical explanation for why the priest crossed to the other side, which is that touching a corpse or a half-dead man would render him ritually impure under Levitical law, preventing him from performing his temple duties. This explanation is often offered as though it excuses or at least contextualizes what the priest does. But it has the opposite effect under examination. It means the priest chose his ritual performance of religion over the actual human being religion commands him to love. He used the religious system to justify the very failure the religious system was designed to prevent. Jesus describes exactly this pattern in his sharpest critique of the religious establishment in Matthew chapter 23. A chapter worth reading in full because it is the most sustained piece of pointed criticism Jesus delivers anywhere in the Gospels. And almost every accusation in it is a description of the persona performing religion, while the shadow operates underneath unchecked. He describes teachers who say and do not do, who tie up heavy loads and put them on others but are unwilling to lift a finger to help carry them, who do everything to be seen by others, who shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces and do not enter themselves, who give 1/10 of their spice gardens while neglecting justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These are not the sins of people who do not care about religion. They are the sins of people so invested in the performance of religion that the performance has replaced the substance, which is precisely what happens when the ego builds a persona around religious identity without integrating the shadow beneath it. And it is exactly the kind of ego defense mechanism Jung described as the most sophisticated form of shadow avoidance, using a legitimate category to justify an illegitimate response without ever having to acknowledge what is actually driving the avoidance. The Levite does the same thing, and the detail that he comes closer before passing by on the other side is significant. He does not avert his eyes immediately. He approaches, he looks, and then he crosses over. This is the moment Jung would describe as the ego making contact with the shadow material and retreating rather than engaging. The Levite sees the man clearly enough to know what he is seeing, and the knowledge of what he is seeing is precisely what sends him across to the other side. Ignorance would be one thing. Seeing and still crossing is something else, and it is the more common human experience. Now the Samaritan arrives, and here is where Jung's framework reveals something that a purely moral reading of the parable tends to flatten. Before examining the Samaritan's arrival, it is worth noting one more layer of the priest and Levite's response that Jung's concept of projection illuminates. The question is not simply why the Samaritan helped when the others did not, as though the answer is just that he was a better person with more compassion. The question is why Jesus specifically chose a Samaritan to play this role, and the answer requires understanding what the Samaritan represented in the shadow economy of first-century Jewish culture. Jung observed that the shadow is not only a personal phenomenon, it operates collectively as well. A community, a culture, or a nation projects its collective shadow. the qualities it refuses to acknowledge in itself, onto an outgroup that it then despises, fears, or dehumanizes. The outgroup carries in the projection all the qualities the in-group cannot tolerate owning. And Jung noted something that disturbs the comfortable categories of moral superiority. The outgroup frequently ends up carrying genuine positive qualities that the in-group has projected onto them along with the negative ones, or that the in-group has abandoned in itself while projecting them outward. Samaritans in first-century Jewish culture were the collective shadow made flesh. They were the ethnically mixed descendants of the northern kingdom's intermarriage with Assyrian settlers. They had their own version of the Torah and their own sacred mountain, and they were regarded by mainstream Jewish culture as theologically corrupted, ritually contaminated, and socially beneath engagement. John chapter 4 notes that Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. The disciples in Luke chapter 9 want to call down fire on a Samaritan village that refused them. The Samaritan is the figure onto whom the collective shadow has been projected. He is what the Jewish community has decided to put outside the boundary of obligation. And Jesus makes him the only one in the story who actually fulfills the law. This is not coincidence. This is the most theologically loaded choice available to Jesus within that cultural context, and it works in exactly the way Jung's framework predicts the encounter with the positive shadow works. The Samaritan stops because he has not built his identity around the kind of ritual purity and social status that makes the wounded man's helplessness threatening to his self-perception. He does not have the same psychological investment in maintaining a certain image of himself that makes the shadow material on the road intolerable to approach. The very thing that made him despised in the culture, his position as the outsider, the unclean, the one who does not belong to the religious establishment, is precisely what freed him to see a wounded human being rather than a threat to his ego structure. The compassion the text describes is not a vague feeling. Luke uses the Greek word splanchnizomai, a term that appears several times in the Gospels to describe Jesus' own response to human suffering, a word that literally refers to the viscera, the gut, indicating a physical response of empathy that bypasses the analytical distance that allows the priest and the Levite to cross to the other side. The Samaritan feels the man's pain in his own body before he acts on it. This is the opposite of projection. Projection creates distance between the self and the other by making the other a screen for what you cannot face in yourself. Compassion collapses that distance by allowing the other's reality to enter your own body. This is also worth noting. The parable is not the only place in the Gospels where Jesus uses a Samaritan encounter to make a theological point that the religious establishment would find uncomfortable. In John chapter 4, Jesus deliberately travels through Samaria and initiates a conversation with a Samaritan woman at a well, crossing two boundaries simultaneously: the ethnic barrier between Jews and Samaritans and the social barrier between a Jewish male teacher and a woman. He offers her what he calls living water, and the conversation that unfolds is one of the most theologically substantive one-on-one conversations recorded anywhere in the Gospels. In Luke chapter 17, when Jesus heals 10 lepers and only one returns to give thanks, the text notes specifically that he was a Samaritan. Jesus asks where the 9 are. The one who returned is the one who should not have, by the categories of the religious world that organized who was expected to respond to God with gratitude. The Samaritans in the Gospel accounts are not random choices of characters. They are a recurring theological statement about where genuine response to God is actually found when the religious establishment has organized itself around avoiding the shadow. Jesus ends the parable by flipping the lawyer's original question in a way that almost nobody notices on first reading. The lawyer asked, "Who is my neighbor?" seeking a definition of who qualifies for his obligation. Jesus asks, "Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" This is not the same question. The lawyer's question is about category, about identifying which people fall inside the circle of obligation. Jesus' question is about character, about which of the three people in the story actually lived the law they all claim to follow. He moves the conversation from defining the boundary to examining the person asking about it. The lawyer wanted to know who he had to love. Jesus shows him what love actually looks like when it moves without checking credentials first. The lawyer cannot bring himself to say the word Samaritan in his answer. He says the one who showed mercy. This detail is the clearest indication that Jesus' choice has landed exactly where he intended. The lawyer knows the answer. He cannot say the name. The shadow is visible to him now, and acknowledging it fully would require a reordering of the categories that have organized his religious world. Jesus tells him simply to go and do likewise. The theological weight of this parable connects to something that runs through the entire gospel narrative: the pattern of God working through the unexpected, the disqualified, and the despised in ways that consistently expose the bankruptcy of the boundaries constructed by religious insiders. It is the pattern of the tax collector going home justified rather than the Pharisee. It is the pattern of the prodigal son being met by a running father while the elder brother stands at the edge of the field. It is ultimately the pattern of the cross itself, where the salvation of the world is accomplished not through the religious establishment that had spent centuries preparing for it, but through a carpenter from Galilee executed as a criminal between two thieves outside the city walls, in the most publicly shameful manner available to Rome. Paul connects this directly in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, writing that God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise, and what is weak in the world to shame the strong, and what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are. The Samaritan is the parable version of this theological principle. Jung's framework explains the mechanism. The Gospels explain the source. The priest and Levite are people whose religious identity has become a persona that functions precisely by keeping the shadow out of sight, including the shadow bleeding on the Jericho road. The Samaritan is someone who has nothing to protect in that way, and whose freedom from the need to maintain a certain self-image is the exact thing that allows him to do what the law requires. And Jesus, in choosing him as the example, is saying something that was already present throughout the Hebrew scriptures, from God's choice of the youngest son, the stuttering leader, the barren woman, and the least of Jesse's sons, that the categories by which human beings decide who is qualified to be used by God are consistently and deliberately inverted by a God who operates from a different set of criteria entirely. The real question this parable leaves you with is not whether you would stop for the wounded man, because most people believe they would. The real question is which person on that road you actually most resemble in the daily structure of your life, not in the dramatic moment of someone bleeding in front of you, but in the ordinary, unremarkable patterns of who you cross the street to avoid, who you have decided falls outside the boundary of your obligation, and what shadow material on the roads you travel every day you are still crossing to the other side to avoid encountering.